Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to yet another, the third bonus episode here on this topic of looking at what the prophets, the so-called quote-unquote prophets and apostles, are saying now about their failed Trump re-election prophecies, now that it's becoming increasingly clear, as we've been saying, that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are the winners of the 2020 election. In fact, just the other day, as I'm doing this recording, this is now the 22nd of November, they did a recount in Georgia and confirmed yet again that Joe Biden was the rightful winner. Trump's lawsuits are getting dismissed left, right, and center. So he's increasingly flailing. He's hidden in the White House. He's disappeared from public view for the most part. When he does do a press conference, he refuses to take questions and he disappears. And so this is what's happening. He is increasingly taking refuge in conspiracy theories. And this is what we're seeing as well from these so-called prophets and apostles that I'm going to be talking about in just a few minutes. What we're seeing now as the weeks have rolled on since Election Day is that it's turning a lot more dark, a lot more conspiratorial, and frankly, dangerous. And I'm going to show you why that is in this third episode today that I've done on this topic. And in fact, there's just so much content, I just don't have time to go into all of it, but it's an hourly, daily uploads of videos on these various channels. In fact, just this morning I was looking at Dr. Lance Wallnau, and he again was repeating a lot of these conspiracy theory thinking and that it's a stolen election. And we're going to see how this all works as the prophets double down conspiracy theories, fear-mongering, and threats around this issue of their failed Trump re-election prophecy. Now more than 3 weeks past Election Day 2020, what are the charismatic Christian Seven Mountains Mandate Dominion Theology prophets and apostles saying now about their failure to predict accurately a Trump victory? As I mentioned in the intro, this is now the third bonus episode I've done on this topic, but with each passing day, they just keep on making increasingly outrageous statements. So I'll just keep covering, I'll comment on each new development as much as I can. And like before, as I mentioned, there's just so much stuff that I've had to leave out. Otherwise, this would probably be a 2, 3, 4 hour episode. So here's their basic problem. As I mentioned in the second episode, if these people were truly prophets of an allegedly omniscient, omnipresent God serving as his mouthpieces or his conduits, as they claim, then they should have gotten the election results completely 100% correct. In other words, if they were truly able to see into the future and predict what was going to happen to a person, they should have predicted a Biden victory and not a Trump landslide. As time goes on, however, and the final tallies confirm a Biden victory and a resounding Trump loss, together with the dismissal of his bogus lawsuits to try to overturn the election, it's abundantly clear that they, to a person, got it 100% wrong, which, according to the biblical record, as I mentioned in the last episode, confirms them as false, lying prophets. Worse yet, what does it say about the supposedly omniscient God that they claim to serve? The reality of their failed prophecies brings about at least 3 possibilities as I see it now, having researched this topic extensively. Option number 1, they are complete frauds and charlatans who are speaking these prophecies completely out of their own deluded imaginations and an overwhelming, desperate desire to see Trump win a second term. Possibility 2, as the prophetic mouthpieces of God, they did in fact speak the very words of God in predicting this future event, and thus it's not their fault. Rather, it was God who was mistaken. The blame lies with him and not them. But what does this say, as I mentioned, about God's supposed power or the ability to know what the future holds? Surely that heretical thought has got to be disconcerting to the evangelical mind. And then finally, possibility number 3, God's plans were, in fact, to have Trump get reelected, but somehow there was a disruption of his orders due to a satanically led demonic confederacy, as Paul the White Cain put it shortly after the election. In this viewing of this situation, Satan and his demonic armies not only successfully frustrated the plans of God to have Trump reelected, but they also dashed the hopes of the legions of blindly loyal Trump-supporting evangelicals too. Again, however, what does this option say about the supposedly omniscient God that they claim to serve, and the will of God, which, according to the Bible, cannot be changed or thwarted? The third possibility sure seems to give Satan and his demons way too much authority and power to disrupt God's plans. But according to their own theology, the Bible states that Satan is the god of this world and has apparently quite a significant amount of authority over this planet. So in this line of thinking, the story goes like this. Essentially, the Democrats, working in league with the powers of evil, successfully stole the election via widespread voter fraud, hacking into or controlling computer voting software to change a Trump vote into a Biden one. Thus it was that they successfully rigged the system to engineer a fraudulent Biden victory. In this, these prophets are merely repeating the conspiracy theory line furthered by both Trump and his loyal sycophants like Rudy Giuliani and Lindsey Graham, to name but a few. Almost to a person, Republican leaders, with the possible exception of Mitt Romney and a couple others, are demonstrating once again how spineless they are and how afraid of Trump's bully pulpit of Twitter as well as his rabidly loyal MAGA army of devotees. Most are saying absolutely nothing or doing absolutely nothing to stop Trump's deliberate blockage of a transition of power to Joe Biden, and his admitting is conceding of defeat, which he of course hasn't done so far. According to Trump's increasingly unhinged conspiracy theory thinking, the storyline goes like this. Despite all the seeming evidence to the contrary of no widespread voter fraud, Trump did, in fact, win, as he himself has stated on numerous occasions since the election day. He won, that is, if you discount the millions of illegal or fraudulent votes. The liberal lamestream media are merely confirming the results of the stolen election and had no business calling it early. That should be rightfully reserved for the courts to decide. If necessary, Trump has stated, he'd take it all the way to his now conservative stacked Supreme Court for final arbitration and a well-deserved victory. According to a piece by David Smith in The Guardian, Smith says, quote, speaking in the White House briefing room on Friday this last week, about an initiative to lower prescription medicine prices, Trump maintained his baseless claim that he was the true winner. Now, Trump speaking, he said, quote, Big Pharma ran millions of dollars of negative advertisements against me during the campaign, which I won, by the way, he told reporters, end quote. Weirdly, however, Trump and his MAGA army of followers are even turning on his ultra-loyal propaganda organ, Fox News. Why? Because they made the unfortunate mistake of calling Arizona for Biden apparently too early. This is just a piece of delicious irony. The only element that the prophets are adding to this completely unfounded conspiracy theory thinking of Donald Trump and his sycophants is the spiritual warfare component, as I've been discussing in the first 2 episodes. Christian media outlets are now noticing these developments in the prophetic community and as a result are running stories. For example, both Christianity Today and the Christian Post recently ran articles about the failed Trump prophecies on their sites. And the 700 Club did a piece a few days after the election talking with some of the prophets who apparently missed it and giving them a chance to explain away or justify their apparently false prophecies. The upshot of the 700 Club piece was this. According to both Kat Kerr and Lou Engle, quote, prophets, who both of whom had prophesied a Trump victory, there would be a sudden and miraculous reversal of fortunes, and the fraud and the deception of the Democrats would be revealed as various state recounts would overwhelmingly show. According to Engle, anyway, this dramatic reversal would follow the narrative account of what happened to the evil character Haman in the biblical story of Esther. Haman had plotted to destroy the Jews who were living in the Persian Empire, only to suffer the same fate he had planned for them in a dramatic plot reversal. The book of Esther contains an ironic twist as it concludes the story. Haman ended up being hung on the very same gallows he had specifically constructed for Esther's uncle Mordecai and his fellow Jews. Unfortunately for both Kerr and Engel, however, now several weeks past the election, even those updated predictions of a miraculous reversal have proven to be false as well. As I talked about in my second bonus episode, Denial, Delusion, and Desperation, all three of the possibilities that I just mentioned are starting to be seen in abundant detail. The prophets are displaying an increasing sense of desperation to somehow justify or explain it all away as anything but a failed false prophecy. Their denial and delusion is now clearly palpable as they face the very real possibility of being outed as charlatans and, perhaps worst of all, losing both their credibility together with their financial support should their formerly loyal followers begin to abandon them. The most bizarre example of the delusion that has gripped these prophets has got to go to pro-Trump cheerleader and hugely famous prosperity gospel preacher Kenneth Copeland. This controversial huckster has been in trouble in the past for his lavish, over-the-top celebrity preacher lifestyle, complete with multiple private jets and a mega mansion with his own personal runway, all paid for, of course, by his nonprofit ministry. On the 8th of November 2020, in what can only be described as maniacal and unhinged, Copeland led his congregation in a nearly 1-minute-long forced laughter session that was both deeply unsettling and, as I say, beyond bizarre. According to Copeland, anyway, a study done by Johns Hopkins University had proven scientifically that laughter was quite literally the best medicine. Thus, for those believers who might be feeling badly that the lying media had prematurely called the election for Biden, and it was looking that Trump might in fact lose, Copeland was on hand to lead them in a bit of restorative humor. And by the way, before I play this clip, and I've got to play it for you, it's just too unbelievable to try to replicate, it's worth mentioning that Copeland's audience was packed inside the church, rammed into the pews, shoulder to shoulder. Most of them were not wearing masks or socially distancing, in all clear defiance of known COVID protocols. Now let's just talk about this for a minute before we get into the Copeland bizarre laughter. As I see it now, it's becoming increasingly clear, well, to me at least, that a significant portion of American evangelicalism is evolving in what can only be described as an apocalyptic death cult. Numerous evangelical and charismatic pastors, most recently John MacArthur, for example, in Southern California, have been in trouble with the law for violating state guidelines during lockdown. For their part, they insist that such rules are a violation of religious freedom and are clearly an effort by big government to trample underfoot Americans' First Amendment rights to free speech and free assembly. The blindly loyal sheep who are following such charlatans take refuge in magical thinking that God will somehow protect them from catching the virus. I've heard numerous evangelicals quote Psalm 91 in some relation to how God will protect them from the plague and pestilence. The sad fact is, however, that they are denying reality around the pandemic by refusing to listen to scientists and health experts. Instead, they refuse to wear masks or socially distance in packed church services, all the while repeating various conspiracy theories promoted both by Trump and evangelical leaders. Beyond lying about and downplaying the virus for months, Trump has called COVID a hoax or promoted the baseless conspiracy theory that it was all some sort of planned pandemic, a plandemic foisted on the world by either China or the deep state. Okay, speaking of charlatans, keep in mind that it was the same Kenneth Copeland who, mere months ago, commanded the COVID-19 virus to be gone in the name of Jesus and blew it away with his breath. But apparently God wasn't listening or was unable to follow up on the job because it didn't magically vanish due to Copeland's deranged demand. Now, several months after Copeland's failure to dispel the virus nationwide, the U.S. is recording the highest numbers of both new cases and deaths due to COVID than ever before. But as these blindly loyal evangelicals who listen to frauds like Copeland have shown time and time again, they are literally willing to put their lives on the line and risk spreading this deadly disease to their friends and family and loved ones, also that they can continue holding church services and maintain what they see as their constitutional rights as Americans. And keep in mind that many of these are the same people who attended recent Trump campaign rallies before the election that turned out to be super spreader events too. But anyway, that's a topic for perhaps another bonus episode in the future. returning to Copeland's unhinged, laughing church service in what was apparently an attempt to portray the media as falsely calling the election in favor of Biden, this is what happened next.
The media said what? The media said Joe Biden's president.
That is seriously creepy and disturbing. Perhaps most unsettling about the whole clip, if you haven't seen it, was to watch the reactions of Copeland's audience. Rather than leaving the service in disgust or recoiling at his insane Joker-like laughter, they instead went along with the famous preacher. And you can hear him in the clip in what could only be described as a cult-like attempt at behavior modification, undue influence, and mind control. When we return from the break, I'll take a look at another so-called prophet that I mentioned in the last show, Dutch Sheets, and his prophetic intercessory journey to the headwaters of the Allegheny River in Pennsylvania. What was he doing there? Oh, only digging a hole to bury some items alongside the riverbank that he felt would overturn the election vote count in Philadelphia. Since that trip, Sheets has not only received more divine revelation from God about his journey, he's actually gone back to the same place, this time taking with him a team of prayer warriors for a live-streamed service. Anyway, more about that after we return from the break. All right, we're just going to take a short break here. I want to talk to you about what's coming up in the next few episodes here on Mindshift Podcast. In a couple of weeks, I've got a chat coming out with Dean Crosets of the People I Meet podcast. This is a really interesting episode because Dean comes out of the charismatic movement, and for a while he was into the Seven Mountains Mandate Dominion theology, which of course has great overlap to what I've been talking about in these bonus episodes. And then I've got Rebecca Drumsta. She comes out of fundamentalist sort of Bible cult background as well, similar to me. And we also had a really interesting discussion about religious trauma syndrome and surviving a fundamentalist upbringing, as well as looking at resources for moving ahead and rebuilding your identity. And then I had a really interesting chat too with a guy called Seven out of Jacksonville, Florida. He's a rapper, really interesting guy. He was a member of a big mega church down in the South. He was the token black guy, as it turned out, on this all-white staff. And he got burned by the church, and now he's walked away from it all. And that is just a really interesting conversation from a guy who's been through the ringer, really. Church hurt plus racism equals deconstruction. So that's coming up as well with Seven out of Jacksonville, Florida. And I just wanted to say, too, that I had a lot of really positive feedback about my conversation with Dara Malloy, the former Catholic priest who's living out on the Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland. Hopefully you found that discussion interesting, talking about Celtic spirituality and uncovering a lot of the really ancient stuff that was sort of corrupted by the Roman Catholic Church and westernized versions of Christianity and religion. So that's a really interesting one. If you haven't heard that one, I'm trying to give people additional sort of points of view, especially around this area of recovering from religious trauma syndrome. I have learned that spirituality can be a really helpful piece in that as well. So catch that episode with Dara Malloy as we talked about Celtic spirituality. Anyway, let's get on back into this bonus episode of looking at how the prophets are doubling down around their failed Trump prophecy. As mentioned before the break, let's take a closer look at Dutch Sheets and his trip to the Allegheny headwaters in Pennsylvania. Coming in at a close second to Kenneth Copeland, receiving the award for the most deluded around the Trump prophecies, is the apostle and prophet Dutch Sheets, who I mentioned in the last episode. If you recall, I talked about how shortly after the election, while Pennsylvania was still in play for Trump in terms of the vote count, Sheets embarked on an intercessory prophetic journey to the headwaters of the Allegheny River in Pennsylvania. As we'll see, Sheets has now confirmed that there was not only one, but actually he led two prophetic trips to this really important place. There, in the headwaters of the Allegheny, according to his fellow prophet, Chuck D. Pierce, on his blog in a November 5th post entitled Maneuvering the Swamp Ahead. Sheets apparently phoned Chuck Pierce shortly after returning from the trip just a few days later. He informed Pierce that there he'd buried a number of items in a hole that he dug by the riverbank. According to Pierce, quote, on Monday he, that is Dutch Sheets, went on a prophetic intercessory journey to the headwaters of the Allegheny, which are in Pennsylvania. There he dug a hole and buried a mercy coin, tuning fork, buckeye from Cane Ridge, appeal to heaven flag, and a key from Constitution Hall. We appeal to heaven for this nation to be retuned with mercy for revival to come, end quote. By the way, if you're interested, you can head over to the Mindshift Podcast Facebook page. I've actually got the picture taken from Chuck Pierce's Twitter feed of the actual items that Sheets buried on the riverbank. You literally could not make this stuff up, but there it is. And while you're there, make sure to like that page as well. As I mentioned in the last episode, this is just beyond bizarre. Now, this is some kind of Harry Potter-esque nonsense, magical thinking, and spell casting that Sheets is involved in. Apparently, according to his logic, or even his theology, somehow by burying all these highly symbolic objects in a hole on the riverbank at the headwaters of the Allegheny River in Pennsylvania, magically its effect would flow downstream and impact the results of the vote count in Philadelphia. Only problem, besides the sheer lunacy of the whole endeavor, the Allegheny River doesn't flow to Philadelphia, but rather to Pittsburgh. So maybe that inconvenient fact explains why Trump didn't win the entire state of Pennsylvania. But Sheets was far from doubling down on his deluded efforts to influence the election results in Pennsylvania. Appearing on his YouTube channel on the 19th of November in a video entitled 3 Dreams About the Headwaters of the Allegheny River, Sheets explained the rationale behind not just 1 or 2, but actually 3 dreams that had apparently been given to him by God about the Allegheny River trip, and actually the 2 trips that he ended up making there. Weirdly, however, in the video, Sheets fails to mention the magical items he'd buried by the river. He merely stated that he'd gone there to pray. That seems to be a fairly convenient lapse of memory, but anyway, there you have it. By the way, Sheets has also launched a prayer campaign called Give Him 15, in which he's calling on his followers to give God 15 minutes per day to pray about what he labels the election crisis gripping America. He claims that over 500,000 people are engaged in this prayer campaign, with concerned Christians even joining in from other countries too, so they can pray for America. That's how seriously he and his supposed 500,000 followers that are praying 15 minutes a day, how they view the whole thing. Anyway, in his YouTube video explaining these 3 dreams, Sheets stated, quote, I was recently given 3 dreams about the Allegheny River. After seeing dreams 2 and 3, I was directed by the Lord to go to its headwaters and pray for the nation. I knew time was of the essence, so I went immediately and did so by myself, agreeing in prayer with several who joined me by phone. A few days later, I called Chuck Pierce and told him about it, and he responded that I needed to go back again. This time I was to involve a larger group of the ecclesia, the church. He goes on. He, that is Chuck Pierce, asked me not to delay, but go right away. He just felt this prophetically. So 4 days later, a team and I went back to Coudersport, Pennsylvania, where the headwaters of the Allegheny are located, end quote. Note, however, as I stated a minute ago, that Sheets does not mention the burial of the magical items on that first trip, which apparently he told Pierce about on that initial phone call and are detailed on Pierce's blog together with a picture of the items. Anyway, Sheets goes on to talk about a wonderful church there, Coudersport Gospel Tabernacle, that opened its doors to him and his team on short notice, but that the event was live streamed from that location on November 16th. If you're interested, apparently you can watch the video of this prayer service on his YouTube channel. Let's take a closer look at this first supposed dream that Sheets had. Well, according to him, the dream involved a vision of then President Donald Trump, who was going to be traveling by boat up the Allegheny River to its headwaters. Oh, and by the way, the reason that Pennsylvania is so important to Sheets and other Christian nationalists is this. Pennsylvania, of course, is where the Founding Fathers signed the Declaration of Independence. Later, they ratified the U.S. Constitution there, thus apparently, in their view, sealing America as an officially Christian nation. And in a minute, I'll talk a little bit more about why it's so important, why these prophets place such high degrees of importance on physical places too. But now back to Dutch Sheets and his prophetic dream. As Trump made his way up the river in his boat, according to the vision, Sheets saw Asian carp. They were fish that kept jumping out of the river and into Trump's boat. Sheets claimed that this is a prophetic warning about China's nefarious designs for America. You see, Asian carp, and how they were trying to attack Trump for his strong stance against China. So he encourages Christians to pray against the Chinese as they came against Trump. Anyway, the madness goes on. Fortunately for Trump, in the vision, according to Sheets anyway, tens of thousands of Christians were lining both sides of the riverbank, faithfully interceding in prayer for Donald Trump. And because of those fervent prayers, the Asian carp failed to sink his boat, and he made it safely to the end of his trip. There, at the river's headwaters, Trump climbed out of his boat and began to decree that America would fulfill the vision that God had for the nation and maintain his purposes for the United States. So why is all this so important for their belief in dominion theology, Christian nationalism, and American exceptionalism, and the role that Trump himself allegedly was to play in helping to get America to return to its Christian nation status? As we've seen over the last 4 years, many American evangelicals viewed Trump not just as a Cyrus, king-like figure from the Bible, prophetically anointed and appointed by God to rule over America as a king. He's more of a savior figure whose policies will steer America back to its Christian roots. And from a dominion theology point of view, as they see it, Trump is helping Christians to achieve dominion, not only over America, but indeed the world. As an example of how it all comes together, Sheets reveals it all when he says, quote, "My assumption," talking about this first dream, "at that time, as Trump was in the first dream decreeing about the future of America at the Alleghenies headwaters," he says, "was that the Holy Spirit was telling us to pray for President Trump, showing us that his policies were needed in order to get us back to our roots, the headwaters, and we did that back in June when the dream came," end quote. So after receiving the second dream from a prophetic friend, Sheets then informed his wife, who told him that he should not delay, but that he should go straight to Pennsylvania. By the way, in case it's not clear, as I talked about a little bit ago, these prophets placed great stock in the importance of physical locations. Now, to their way of thinking, and in their dominionist seven-mountain mandate theology, it's all about spiritual warfare. Geographical places where important events have occurred in the past still have some kind of binding influence on the present as they see it. There may be, for example, generational curses that need to be first identified by the prophets and the apostles, and then second, these curses can be lifted by engaging in spiritual warfare and intercessory prayer. Examples include, for example, broken treaties in the past with Native Americans, or massacres and that kind of thing, or the buying and selling of African slaves in key cities or places in the South. Failure to deal with these issues of past sins, in their view, will result in problems manifesting themselves in the present. This theology thus explains why Pennsylvania is so important to prophets like Sheets and Pierce in terms of the founding father, that connection there, and their vision of Christian nationalism, but also why it was important symbolically that Sheets traveled to the headwaters of the Allegheny River too. So as he traveled there, Sheets claimed that he received word of the third dream from another prophetic friend, which blew his mind because it was apparently about the headwaters of the Allegheny River, the very place to which he was in the process of traveling. Surely this is a divine appointment. This dream was a real doozy because it involved a special appearance of the ghost of Thomas Paine standing on the riverbank alongside Sheets, according to the dream. Paine was one of the contemporaries of George Washington and a favorite of Christian nationalists because of his apparently evangelical beliefs. So according to this third vision, Sheets claimed that it was all about spiritual warfare as it related to the election process and the true God-ordained destiny of America. The ghost of Thomas Paine, according to the dream, had apparently been using the intervening centuries since his death, practicing his skills as an American football quarterback. Keep in mind that the sport hadn't even been invented back in the 18th century. Nonetheless, according to the dream, from the riverbank, Payne successfully tossed Sheets a football, and Sheets effortlessly caught it. Upon further examination of the ball itself, Sheets discovered that the football had the word triumph printed on it in silver letters. After examining the ball and realizing both its symbolic and spiritual importance, Sheets immediately knew what he had to do. He placed the ball in a nearby stream, which became a river that flowed all the way down to Washington, D.C. And of course, the ball floated all the way down to D.C., and something in it would be released once it arrived, according to Sheets. I can't help but see this whole vision turned into a Scooby-Doo cartoon version, complete with ghosts throwing footballs. Anyway, so this third fantastical vision is, just like the other two, all about Christian nationalism and the role that Trump would play in achieving that vision. This is why it was so important that he got elected to a second term. Though he wasn't sure at first, Sheets claimed that he is now certain that he's on the right track with his 2 trips to the Allegheny River's headwaters. He declared, quote, "I went first by myself, then with the ecclesia, the church, alongside, to declare the purposes of God for America from that place. Though we don't always know initially, obviously we don't, why God says to do certain things, I certainly didn't know fully why he was sending me there. I just knew he said, go. I knew then later I was to go back with the group, and I know now much more about it. But we don't always know why God says to do certain things, but he knows. We simply obey what he says." And he ends by saying, "And I am very sure now, 100% sure, that the declarations and decrees that we made from that region, like the football set in the river, have power in them to shift our nation." End quote. Not to spend too much time on Sheets, but I think this whole thing, as it shakes out, is a fantastic example, or a real-life case study, of the complete delusion of not just these so-called prophets, as they flail around trying to justify their bogus predictions, but also the truly bizarre nature of much of evangelical and charismatic theology. When you step back and look at it objectively, it's really quite a crazy system. In his video, for example, Sheets concludes his explanation of the 3 prophetic dreams by encouraging his followers when they pray to make sure and remind the Lord of his own promises. What promises? Well, about America, and what he's supposedly going to do in order to bring about a major revival and an unprecedented season of blessing like never before seen. I mean, how many times have we heard that line from evangelicals and charismatic, that we're just on the verge of a major season of blessing, but never seems to actually happen. This sort of theology not only combines the myth of Christian nationalism together with magical thinking, but upon further examination of it, I've got a lot of questions, such as, why do Christians have to remind their God of anything? Although he's supposedly omniscient and omnipresent, all-powerful and everywhere present at all time, is he that forgetful that he can't remember what he said he would do, like a senile old grandfather? Does he really need to be prompted constantly by millions of nagging Christians praying worldwide to act on their behalf? The whole thing, to me, sounds like a very withholding parent who needs to be nagged by their children to do anything nice for them. Why does he need to be asked and reminded all the time? And as I mentioned earlier, if God's intention was to have Trump get reelected for a second term, how powerful is he that Satan and his demons can so easily thwart his plans? Why does he need the prophets and intercessors to step into the breach and help him win this spiritual battle? Of course, they'll answer that this is the whole point of faith and about partnering with God to help bring about his kingdom. I mean, there's always an answer, isn't there? This entire mentality that we're hearing from guys like Sheets and Pierce about the need to remind God when praying, also, it brings to my mind a popular evangelical movement several years ago that hit upon the notion of praying Scripture back to God. If you're an ex-evangelical, you'll no doubt remember the many books written and sermons preached on this topic back then. How was it supposed to work? Well, Christians are supposed to have a daily prayer time, which we also refer to as our quiet times. We were encouraged to quote Bible verses back to God in order to remind him of the promises in Scripture. It was as if he had forgotten them and needed to be reminded of what he had said he would do for us. But again, what kind of a religious system is this? All it does is to affirm, in my mind at least, just one of the many reasons why I walked away from it all. All right, so when we come back from the next break, I'm going to get into this issue of how these so-called prophets have little choice but to continue to repeat Donald Trump's increasingly absurd and baseless conspiracy theories that the election was stolen due to rampant voter fraud, bogus software, ironically named Dominion, which I'll talk more about toward the end, and other nefarious influences like communist money flowing from China through Venezuela. All right, we're going to take a short break here. I just wanted to give a quick thank you to all the people who have recently supported Mindshift Podcast on Patreon. Thank you to Heidi Marsh and Samantha Milbrecht for your support of this show, and also Victoria Horton-Newman all the way from Tasmania. She has increased her pledge up from $1 a month to $5 a month. So thank you for that. I have sent out some really cool gifts recently from North Wales. If you support the show at a $5 level, I'll send you something really cool from North Wales. If you support the show at a $10 level a month, I'll give you a free Mindshift Podcast t-shirt. What do you get for being a supporter of the show on Patreon? First of all, you get early release to all the episodes. They tend to drop on Wednesday on Patreon before they come out on Fridays everywhere else. Plus, you get access to the closed Mindshift Podcast Facebook group, and it's in there that we have our monthly Mindshift Podcast Zoom calls. And in fact, tonight, the 22nd of November, as I'm doing this recording, in just a few hours, we're going to have our second Zoom call of this month. We had Peter Montgomery from the Right Wing Watch drop in on the 8th of November. And in fact, if you want to see that video, head over to the Mindshift Podcast Facebook page. I put it up there so you can see what we talked about. But tonight, we've got Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead, who are the authors, of course, of the book Taking America Back for God, all about Christian nationalism and how it relates to the Trump vote. So obviously we're going to have a lot to talk about as this election is shaking itself out. And then in December, we've got Frank Schaeffer. He's going to come in probably the second week of December before the holidays really get started. So I'm really excited about having Frank come back in. As I mentioned in the last episode, I've just finished working through his book, Crazy for God, which is really good. I would recommend it. And I'm just about to start his other book, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God. And we are going to have a podcast episode on those two books at some point as soon as I finish reading this second book. So some really cool stuff. And then we've got Rebecca Drumsta book for January. So some absolutely fantastic benefits to being a supporter of this show on Patreon. It helps me cover my monthly expenses so I can keep bringing you this show. All right, let's get on back into the conclusion of this third bonus episode, looking at how these prophets are doubling down around the Trump failed prophecies, and also now they're starting to embrace increasingly bizarre conspiracy theories. So let's finish up this episode. And I think you'll be surprised to find out just how dark and conspiratorial this whole thing is now becoming. Let's conclude this episode by looking at this issue of widespread voter fraud and all the conspiracy theories that these prophets are now trumpeting. As I mentioned before the break, in addition to the supposed spiritual warfare element that apparently helped thwart the plans of God to have Trump win a second term, the prophets are fleshing out this explanation by incorporating now conspiracy theories into the mix. Apparently, in their way of thinking, this was how the theft was accomplished. But weirdly, their talking points sound suspiciously like the same ones Trump has been pushing for weeks now. As I mentioned, the only piece they're adding is that of a spiritual warfare component. Let's take a look at how these folks are putting their unique spin on the conspiracy theories surrounding the allegedly stolen election. In my first bonus episode, When Prophecy Fails, I talked about George Pearsons. If you remember, he's the pastor of Eagle Mountain International Church, which is an arm of Kenneth Copeland Ministries out of Newark, Texas. He's married to Terry, who is Kenneth and Gloria Copeland's oldest daughter, and he regularly appears on Copeland's Believer's Voice of Victory program. In other words, if it wasn't for nepotism, he would most likely not be where he is today. If you recall from that first show, I talked about how Pearson said shortly after the election that God is not happy about the election results. Around the same time, his wife Terry went on record in a church service claiming that the U.S. Congress would miraculously be restored to a righteous Republican majority which, sorry, Terry, it didn't happen, by the way. But in his ongoing efforts to prove that the election results were fraudulently obtained, which must explain why God wasn't very happy, George Pearsons preached a sermon at his church, and it was posted on YouTube on November 17, 2020. In this sermon, he made use of some truly creative hermeneutics, some unknown Bible translations, and biblical verse manipulation. And thanks once again to the Right Wing Watch for flagging up this video and posting it on their YouTube channel. As he preached his sermons, Pearsons appeared to quote from the New Testament book of James, chapter 5, verse 4. But it was from a translation of the Bible I'd never heard of, and I searched everywhere to find it to no avail. I did a Google search, had no results. I even checked the Bible Gateway app, which has numerous English translations from which you can choose, but the version that Pearsons used was not one of them. On screen, it said he was using the PGV version of the Bible, but I'd never heard of it, nor had I heard of the translation of this verse that he was using. But let me tell you, it worked beautifully for his purposes. Using this bogus translation, Pearsons continued to express his, and of course God's, outrage over the election results. Apparently, says Pearsons, now the very ballots themselves are crying out, apparently because they were all cast fraudulently or illegally manipulated by software. According to the PGV version of the Bible, James 5:4 says, according to Pearsons anyway, quote, "Behold, the ballots of the laborers who have voted in this election that have been kept back by fraud cry out, and the cries of them which have voted are entered into the Lord of the armies of the hosts of heaven," end quote. Now let me just stop right there. I'm a biblical scholar. I'm a former preacher. Although I'm no longer a Christian, on purely an academic level, to me, what Pearsons is doing is deeply offensive. The actual text of James 5, if you read it in context, is a screed against rich people who have abused and exploited their workforce. Whatever Pearsons is doing is not only taken wildly out of context, he's using a completely bogus translation that in no way accords to the Greek text of the book of James. It's worth stating that modern Bible versions of the New Testament are but translations of the Greek text in which the various books were written. Looking at the historical context, the book itself is identified in James 1:1 as a letter from the Apostle James, quote, to the 12 tribes of Israel scattered abroad. In other words, it's addressed to Jewish Christians throughout the Roman Empire. Now, according to the NIV translation, James 5:1-6 reads as follows in context. Now, quoting from James, quote, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days." Now here's verse 4, what Pearsons was allegedly translating. "Look, the wages you, the rich people, failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you." End quote. In other words, there's absolutely nothing in this text from the book of James that speaks of voters or ballots crying out whatsoever. It's about rich, stingy, fat cats who refuse to pay their workers, cheating their workers who harvested their fields and who rightly deserve to be paid for their labor. It has nothing whatever to do with any sort of election or fraudulent ballots being cast. And also, can I just point out that as I read the text, it's expressly condemning rich fat cats like Pearsons and his conspicuously wealthy father-in-law, Kenneth Copeland. This is the same prosperity gospel preacher who has apparently amassed a personal fortune of somewhere between, by his own estimation, somewhere between $300 and $760 million. This absurd amount of personal wealth has allowed him and his wife Gloria to live in an over-the-top mega mansion and live an ultra-luxury lifestyle comparable to that of a business tycoon or mega wealthy celebrity. It's also, as I mentioned before, it's a lifestyle that includes private jets and a personal runway behind his mansion, all paid for, of course, by his nonprofit ministry. Anyway, back to Pearson's and his uber-creative biblical exegesis. After reading from the PGV translation of the book of James, he comments, quote, "So not only are the voters crying out, not only are we raising our voices over this corruption and this fraud, but the ballots are doing the same thing," end quote. And here the audience whoops and has amens and cheers coming out of the crowd. Now, I wasn't aware that a ballot could cry out, but anyway, there you have it. Pearson's next repeats Trump's conspiracy theory thinking by casting doubt on the legitimacy of the election results. He goes on to say, quote, "There are mail-in ballots. Some people in some places received 4 and 5 of those, and they used 4 and 5 of those." So apparently the same person voted, 4 or 5 times? And he goes on to say, and let's say that they got 4 in the mail, and they sent 4 in. That's 3 of them, the ballots, that are crying out, "Wrong, this is not right, this is deception." It's crying out. And he goes on, "There are others through software that votes have changed. You'd better believe those ballots are crying out, 'This is a lie, this is not right, this is not right.'" All the way down the line, he says, even to people who have died and gone to heaven. You know the image that you've seen of the guy with a clipboard in a cemetery writing down names, especially if those people are born again. They're in heaven right now, and they're crying out. They're crying out against the injustice of this. And he concludes, says, "You cannot come against the Lord of the Sabaoth." Now, why he pronounces it that way, I don't know. "The Lord of angel armies. Angels have been dispatched. They are out there. This is why that voice is crying out. It is not just the people, it is the ballot itself." End quote. So let's just get this straight. According to George Pearson's then, not only are the fraudulent ballots themselves crying out, although what his point is in making that statement, I'm not sure, so are all the dead people, especially dead Christians who are all in heaven now, whose names were illegally used, allegedly, to cast votes for Biden. And by the way, did you catch the last point he made? He's agreeing with Paula White-Cain, which I talked about in the last 2 episodes. Pearson's basically repeats her own words verbatim, that angels have been dispatched by God and are apparently out there doing what exactly? Apparently the angels are working hard to overturn the election results. They're working to defeat the demonic confederacy that, according to Paula White-Cain anyway, put one over on God and stole the election for Biden. Now let's look at a second example of this. In agreement with both Trump and Pearson's about the alleged widespread voter fraud and stolen election is Mario Murillo, a Christian journalist and founder of the catchily named Mario Murillo Ministries, MMM, out of Reno, Nevada. He also runs a website called Living Proof. Murillo appeared on Flashpoint on November 18th, 2020. Flashpoint is another of Kenneth Copeland's various ministry channels associated with his show Believer's Voice of Victory. Murillo informed the host of Flashpoint that not only did he believe that Trump won the election, he also parroted the Trump conspiracy theory party line. Note also how Murillo makes use of fear-mongering and partisan division to whip up the outrage of the Trump-supporting evangelical base who are angry right now over what they perceive as a stolen election. Murillo stated, quote, "I believe Donald Trump won this election. I believe he won it by a large majority. I believe that fraud has been implemented in order to rob the United States of the duly elected candidate that they have chosen, and there are reasons for why." And he goes on. He says, "There is an anti-American spirit. These people hate America. They hate our history. They hate our freedom. They hate what we represent. And unfortunately, a great deal of them have poisoned our children with that same hatred." End quote. I'm not sure who they are exactly, but I think it's clear that Murillo is referring to anyone who's a liberal who obviously voted for Biden. And I have to say that on at least one point, I think a lot of Americans might actually agree with Murillo. They are indeed starting to hate what American evangelical Christians like him represent. And I think, too, that when he talks about certain people poisoning American children with their leftist hatred of America and its history, this, I think, is an allusion to the constant attacks by the Christian right on the public school system in America. I've heard that same sort of line from other evangelicals and Christian reconstructionists before. Murillo goes on to say that the election is not about Donald Trump, but as a result of his loss, and of course the failure of the prophets to predict accurately that he would win, a great number of American Christians are now feeling an overwhelming sense of malaise and indifference going forward. Continuing with his fear-mongering, Murillo comes dangerously close to advocating some form of civil disobedience by Christians when he continues. He says, quote, "The first thing we got to do is to realize that a second American Revolution has started. We cannot accept the results of this election. We have to, in our last drop, in our last breath, in our last strength, understand that our duty as Americans is to oppose this and to demand a full and free investigation, and to summarily realize that if it is denied, if that is denied the American people, we can say why it was," end quote. And then he concludes with some really quite dark statements, saying, quote, "We have been taken over. An evil force has taken us over, and it's nothing less than that. And I think that anyone who's bewildered or confused or on either side of the fence is missing the point. This is a fraudulent election that must be confirmed, or the people will never believe it again. You will never see another Republican president elected in your lifetime," end quote. So here we go. Once again, we see Murillo agreeing with Trump, Giuliani, Copeland, Pearsons, that the election results were bogus, fraudulent. They needed to be overturned. Of course, they would say this. Their very career, as I've been saying, as prophets, depends on them readjusting the narrative, spinning it away in order to explain their fraudulent predictions. And as I mentioned, also note how Murillo makes use of a classic Christian right tactic, fear-mongering. They have been using this for decades now, as identified by Conway and Siegelman in their now classic work on the origins of the Christian right, Holy Terror. But if you thought Murillo's comments were over the line, that's nothing compared to my third and final example of just how dark these guys are getting with their threats and their fear-mongering. I've now saved the best for last. Far-right extremist Pastor Rick Wiles, host of the True News Network, that's TRU News, and senior pastor of Flowing Streams Church out of Vero Beach, Florida. Wiles has long been known to be a conspiracy theorist and an anti-Semitic, homophobic, transphobic, Islamophobic, far-right evangelical nut who has made some truly hate-filled, racist, and outrageous statements over the years. For example, Wiles claimed numerous times that President Obama was a demon from hell who was America's jihadist-in-chief, in addition to promoting other bizarre conspiracy theories, such as, for example, that Great Britain's Queen Elizabeth, who's actually a lizard person, secretly engineered events behind the scene to have Princess Diana murdered in Paris. Why would she do this? Because Princess Diana, according to Wiles, was just about to go public to reveal the royal family's involvement in Satanism, so of course she had to be silenced. He's a pronounced anti-Semite, too. He's made multiple references to an international Jewish cabal that is secretly plotting to rule the world. And if you remember, he garnered a lot of attention during Trump's impeachment hearing because he said it was, quote, infested with Jews and was in reality a quote-unquote Jew coup. So I found an interesting article on Rick Wiles by one of my recent guests, Rob Boston, who writes for the Americans United for the Separation of Church and State website. After listening in amazement to an episode of Wiles' True News radio show, Boston did some digging into his background and found out plenty. Boston stated in his article, quote, Wiles' website says the show, his True News show, which is broadcast over shortwave, focuses on the following topics of interest. Now quoting from his website. This is what they focus on: Christian news, Bible prophecy news, end time news, last days news, Antichrist and Mark of the Beast, New World Order news, True News, Big Brother and surveillance news, implanted microchips, apostasy, and falling away, end quote. So this gives you an idea as to what Rick Wiles and his True News program are all about. Anyway, appearing on his True News channel on November 18th, 2020, Wiles went beyond the typical dismissal of the election results as fraudulent. Of course, he believes and promotes all the baseless conspiracy theories of a stolen election. He's even come up with some new ones. He is now openly advocating violence against the lefties, as he calls them, who supported Biden and are therefore part of a coming communist revolution. In addition to this wild, unfounded claim, Wiles also promoted baseless lies about COVID, Black Lives Matter, and Antifa. In his warped conspiracy theory way of thinking, it all comes together around the election and the mysterious cabal, maybe the international Jews or the deep state, who are somehow behind it all, manipulating everyone like an unseen puppet master pulling the strings. Note how Wiles constantly refers to the mysterious they, the same ones perhaps that Mario Murillo believes were behind the stolen election, as well as George Pearsons. I don't know. So Wiles stated, quote, so coronavirus was part of it, then they brought out Black Lives Matter, then they brought out Antifa, then they stole the election, and now they're bringing back coronavirus. And when they do that, they're going to bring back Black Lives Matter and Antifa. You know what? This time, we're going to meet you in the streets. Come on, come, left. And he starts motioning forward like someone inviting you to a fist fight. He goes on, we're going to meet you in the streets this time. You know what they're doing here in Florida? The governor wants a bill passed in Florida to empower citizens to shoot and kill looters and rioters. Yes, sir. Get it done, Governor. The people are with you. We're going to defend this state of Florida. We're not going to put up with this stuff anymore. And he concludes by saying, the left, you better pack up and flee. You'd better, if you're part of this communist revolution, lefty, you'd better get out of the country. If we find out that you're part of the communist revolution, we're coming after you, all right? I don't care. FBI, put my name down on the list. Go ahead and do it. Do it. I don't care, end quote. Now, while admittedly Rick Wiles is an extremist, a racist, anti-Semite, conspiracy theorist promoting crackpot ideas, what's truly frightening about his rhetoric is that it's moved beyond the others I've mentioned who are merely disputing the results of the election. Wiles, who, keep in mind, is an actual pastor of a church in Florida, is now openly advocating violence against the so-called lefties. But what are these lefties up to? Well, they're part of, as he claims, an alleged communist revolution. So why do I consider such rhetoric dangerous? Why don't we just simply dismiss Wiles as the crank and the racist crackpot that he so clearly is? Well, as Sarah Posner documents in her book Unholy, and as we talked about in that podcast episode a few months ago, what we are increasingly seeing now is what she calls an arranged marriage of convenience between the Christian right and the alt-right. White supremacists and neo-Nazis are climbing in bed with the Christian right, and it seems that both sides are becoming more and more comfortable with the arrangement as it coalesces around their rabid support for Trump. In other words, there's an increasing overlap between these two groups, such that the distinctions are becoming increasingly blurred. The whole God, guns, and Trump mentality works for many within both groups. Fortunately, we didn't see the violence spilling out into the streets as a great many worried pundits predicted on or around Election Day itself, but keep in mind that this thing is far from over. Although it seems abundantly clear that Trump's bogus legal claims attacking the veracity of the votes are being swatted down in numerous states, Biden has yet to be officially sworn in as president. Lots can happen between now and then. We cannot underestimate the depths to which Trump and his loyal sycophants will sink in order to overturn the election results. So who exactly is in Trump's corner? As we've seen now in this third bonus episode, we've got this ultra-loyal cadre of Trump evangelicals and charismatic prophets who had bet everything on a Trump win. This was even to the point that they had all confidently prophesied a Trump re-election victory, if not a landslide. Their only hope now hinges on the increasingly vanishing chance that somehow, against all the odds, the election results would be miraculously overturned. Committed to a narrative of widespread voter fraud and a rigged system, all they can do is continue to double down and try to explain away their failed prophecies. In fact, I just need to take a second to point this one out. I believe I mentioned in the first bonus episode the irony of the voter software that was used in multiple states called Dominion. I knew it would just be a matter of time until this became a bone of contention. And sure enough, a friend of mine, Shannon, alerted me on Twitter the other night about a tweet that had been posted by @HemantMeta. This was a clip from the Kenneth Copeland live stream show called America Stands on November 18th, 2020. In the clip, host Greg Stevens is talking about the name of the Dominion software with guest Mark T. Barkley, who apparently is sitting in what appears to be his own private jet during the interview, bizarrely. Stevens and his co-host, Tim Fox, had just finished making the tired old points that evangelicals didn't elect a pastor, we elected a president, about Trump, how the election was all about a war, about political correctness and the annihilation of free speech, and that, in fact, according to Barkley anyway, many liberals actually love Trump's policies and what he's allegedly done for America. It's just that they can't stand his tweeting and his name-calling, so they were actually voting against that and not for Biden. Anyway, okay. Back to the topic of the Dominion voting software and how it all somehow relates to a vast conspiracy to steal the election for Biden. The host, Stevens, says to Barkley, quote, Just the name of this software makes me mad because we look at things through a biblical worldview. Michigan Republicans told the Washington Examiner on November 7th that they are expanding their investigation into Dominion after Antrim County found the software had erroneously tabulated 6,000 votes to Democratic nominee Joe Biden instead of President Donald Trump. End quote. Notice how Stevens doesn't say President-elect Joe Biden, but instead Democratic nominee Joe Biden. And he goes on to say, quote, the state party's chairwoman, Laura Cox, said last week that 47 Michigan counties used software from Dominion in the same way that county did, and Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson disputed some of the claims made by Republicans, attributing the problem to human error and not this Dominion software. Doc Barkley, I hear Dominion software and it makes me angry, he says, because the believer was given dominion. And he holds up his Bible and he goes on, and why, how dare they use that to steal an election? That name, something rises up within me, this whole Dominion software thing there in Michigan, end quote. And Mark Barclay offers up this unbelievable response. He says, quote, 99% of anybody who uses the word Dominion is Christianity. And again, this is just how I see it, guys, and I think I see it right. I mean, I don't want to sound arrogant, but look it, they're stealing Christianity and everything important that's us. It's called Antichrist. And he goes on, they steal Christmas from us. It turns into Santa Claus and flying reindeer and etc. They steal Easter from us, and it's a bunny with eggs. And this word dominion, that's our word. That's a Bible word. It's almost like, how dare you even use it in this context? And then, if you look into dominion, and I'm not an IT guy, but I'm not deaf, dumb, blind, and stupid either. And he concludes by saying, you look into this software and what it does and how easily it could be manipulated. And by the way, who's manipulating it and who's governing it? This is an antichrist, anti-America, anti-justice, anti-fairness, and it's being proven. And so they need to do something about it, like maybe just get rid of it, end quote. Once again, as soon as I heard that this voting software was called Dominion, I knew it would just be a matter of time until these Dominionists became irate and offended at the use of what they consider to be their word. So, as we conclude, once again, we see the collaboration of evangelicals pushing baseless conspiracy theories, the same sorts of talking points promoted by Trump and his self-described elite strike force team working on behalf of the president, headed up by Rudy Giuliani. In fact, just the other day, as I'm doing this recording, Trump's crack legal team held a presser in Washington, D.C. The unhinged one where Giuliani's dark brown hair dye gave it up under the hot lights and started streaming down his cheeks. Of course, the internet had a field day with that scene. But at the press conference, Giuliani and his fellow lawyers ranted on about a whole variety of utterly unproven conspiracy theories. Among other things, he railed against rampant voter fraud, vote counts being conducted in Venezuela and Germany, the influx of communist money from China that had been somehow funneled through Cuba and then Venezuela in order to interfere in the election. And apparently on election night, he talked about trucks bringing in hundreds of thousands of Biden votes held in garbage cans in the middle of the night when few honest people were around to see it and cry foul. At one point, bizarrely, Giuliani even reenacted a scene from the comedy movie My Cousin Vinny. But then another lawyer on the elite strike force team, Sidney Powell, followed Giuliani's unhinged performance. Among her more questionable statements, according to a November 20th article in the Daily Mail, were these, quote, in her series of bizarre claims, she said Hugo Chavez, who died in 2013, was part of a group of communists from China and Venezuela helping to rig the election in Joe Biden's favor. She also claimed that operators of Dominion voting machines went in and injected votes for Biden while deleting votes for Trump. She has shown no proof of her claims. And the article continues, she has said that she will, quote, release the Kraken when it comes to proving voter fraud, a phrase that trended on Twitter, end quote. You know what? I just had a thought. Maybe the ghosts of Hugo Chavez and Thomas Paine should get together on this thing because clearly they both have a vested interest in coming back from beyond the grave to help get Trump reelected. I'll make sure and put Dutch Sheets in touch with Trump's crack legal team. But ghosts aside, of course, even during the gong show of a press conference, President Donald Trump was busily watching and live tweeting. He praised his lawyers' efforts, putting out a tweet that proclaimed, quote, An open and shut case of voter fraud, massive numbers, end quote. As we step back, we examine this whole thing more objectively. It's clear that both Trump and his crack legal team, together with these so-called prophets, are working hard to promote baseless conspiracy theories regarding the election results. But as they protest more and more loudly about a supposedly stolen election, what's becoming more and more clear is that it's Trump who is in fact engaging in the very process of trying to steal this election. As his bogus lawsuits get dismissed in state after state, his latest desperate gambit is to try to have Republican electors appointed in swing states that he lost so he can have their electoral college votes and not Biden, the rightful winner. I'm not making this up. One of Trump's lawyers, Sidney Powell, went on Fox Business Network on Thursday, the 19th of November. She stated on the show, quote, "The entire election, frankly, in all the swing states should be overturned, and the legislature should make sure that the electors are selected for Trump," end quote. This is his own lawyer saying this. The fact that the prophets are promoting Trump's baseless conspiracy theories and now are urging their followers to engage in civil disobedience or even violence in the streets like Rick Wiles recommends, it's beyond irresponsible. It's frankly dangerous. And all this, ironically, from supposedly peace-loving, forgiving Christians who represent, they say, a loving God. How ironic. So as we conclude this third look at the failed Trump prophecies and how this bizarre story is playing out, it's fascinating to me to watch all this unfold. I think it's a living case study of what I've been talking about for the last year or so in terms of the Christian right, evangelicalism, dominion theology, and all that. It's a challenge to try and predict where all this is going. And as I've hopefully demonstrated in these 3 episodes on this subject, it's becoming more and more clear that these prophets are busily scurrying around trying to whip up their followers' outrage against a supposedly fraudulent and stolen election. They're also parroting the increasingly bizarre and unhinged conspiracy theories touted both by Trump and his elite strike force team of lawyers who are out to, in their words, make sure the Constitution is protected. Other than the whole spiritual warfare angle, that's really the only other card they have left to play. It's their final desperate gambit to try and hold on to any shred of credibility at all. As this narrative continues to unfold, as we've now seen, one really striking aspect of it is how dark these evangelicals and charismatics are becoming in their warnings and their threats about what the future holds for American Christians. By refusing to accept the results of the election and whipping up the fear, anger, and outrage of their followers, which also, of course, makes up a large part of Trump's ultra-loyal base, what they're doing is extremely dangerous and irresponsible. The truly scary part to me about all this is we're witnessing both the Christian right and the Republican Party slide further into authoritarianism. The two are becoming increasingly inseparable from each other, and this merger has only sped up over the last 4 years. This has been happening at the same time that Trump has engineered a total takeover of the Republican Party and turned it into his own political cult of personality. The reality is this, as I see it, Donald Trump is merely the symptom of the much deeper problems that have been lurking beneath the surface. They've been there for decades now. Personally, I'm unsure if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris can actually bring the nation back together since it's so deeply polarized and divided. And in addition, can Americans address the factors that led to the rise of a man like Donald Trump to such a powerful position in the first place? The truly frightening part is, to me, in 2024, if a candidate appears who's even more extreme than Trump, but is much more articulate and charismatic than him, then both America and the world will be in more serious trouble then. Let's not forget that over 70 million Americans voted for Donald Trump in this last election. What can you do? Well, first of all, I think it's critically important to educate yourself as to what's happening in this insane world with the merger of the Christian right, evangelicalism, and far-right politics. Secondly, as I've said before, I will also be here to help educate and inform you as to what is going on. You can follow me on Twitter at Mindshift2018. You can also look up the Mindshift Podcast Facebook page. DM me there on Twitter. Let me know what you think of this episode or any of the other ones on this stuff of these failed Trump prophecies. Thanks for listening in. Sorry that it went so long. If there's more information coming out, which is absolutely certain there will be, We're going to be doing more bonus episodes. I'll see you later in a couple of weeks with the episode featuring Dean Krotzetz as we talk about how he escaped from the bizarre world of charismatic evangelical Christianity.